Welcome to This Explainer. If you look at the landscape of global politics today, you see a world completely defined by massive, high-stakes shifts in power. I mean, we constantly hear about rising nations, established superpowers, and honestly, the anxiety of an inevitable collision. But the blueprint for understanding today's tensions? It wasn't drafted in some modern think tank. It was actually drafted thousands of years ago. It's this ancient rule of superpower conflict that perfectly explains the terrifying friction we're seeing on the world stage right now. Okay, let's dive into this. The Thucydides Trap describes a highly volatile dynamic. It's what happens when a rising power starts to challenge a ruling one. Tensions grow, fear sets in, and the risk of war absolutely spikes. It's essentially a structural stress test of international relations. Think of it like a giant boxing match. You've got an established heavyweight champion, and you've got this hungry, rapidly growing contender. The dynamic between those two positions creates a very specific and very dangerous kind of geopolitical friction. To understand where this concept actually comes from, we have to jump way back to the 5th century BC. The whole idea is named after Thucydides, who was an Athenian general and a historian. He was observing the world around him, specifically the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. And in his famous history of that war, he observed a fundamental truth. He wrote, "The growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Lacedaemon, which was Sparta, made war inevitable." He wasn't just looking at the battlefield tactics, He was looking at the deeper psychological forces driving the conflict. And this brilliantly illustrates the psychological mindset of these two ancient powers. It's a dynamic analyzed really closely by Harvard political scientist Graham Allison, who actually coined the modern phrase Thucydides Trap back in 2012. He broke down these mindsets perfectly. On one side, you have Athens. Their growing influence makes them super confident, but also highly sensitive to any perceived slights. They feel like they deserve more respect. Then, on the other side, you have Sparta, the established power. They are alarmed by this rapid growth, and they view the rising power's behavior as totally unreasonable and deeply threatening to the status quo. It's literally a perfect psychological storm. So, how did this observation from ancient Greece become a total staple of modern foreign policy? Well, let's fast forward to 2012. Graham Allison and his research team at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center wanted to know if this was just a quirk of ancient history or if it was a persistent rule of human civilization. To find out, they undertook this massive study. They analyzed 500 years of global power shifts just to test this ancient theory against the hard facts of recorded history. They combed through the historical record over those 5 centuries, looking for very specific conditions. Moments where a rising power directly challenged an established ruling power. And out of the last 500 years of global history, they identified a very specific number of these exact scenarios. That number is 16. Just 16 times in half a millennium, the exact conditions for the Thucydides trap were perfectly met. Now, what's really interesting about this is the grim reality of how those 16 cases played out. It's staggering, really. Out of 16 historical instances where a rising power challenged a ruling one, 12 ended in war. Only 4 managed to avoid a violent conflict. Those are incredibly high-stakes odds. It shows that while conflict isn't necessarily guaranteed, the historical odds are heavily stacked toward a devastating clash whenever this specific power dynamic is in play. Let's look at how this actually manifests on a timeline. In the 17th century, France challenged Habsburg dominance, which directly contributed to the horrific 30 Years' War. Jump to 1914, and a relatively contained occurrence, an assassination, sparked the massive chain of events leading to World War I. Then, in the early 20th century, the rise of Japan pushing against the established presence of the U.S. culminated in the devastating Pacific War during World War II. Over and over, the trap has consistently triggered massive global consequences. Which brings us squarely to the modern era, and honestly, the most pressing geopolitical relationship on the planet today, the relationship between the United States and China. The Thucydides trap is no longer just a subject for university history departments, right? It has become a central, recurring theme in high-level diplomacy. Both nations are acutely aware of the historical data we just went through. The U.S. sits in the position of the established ruling power, while China occupies the role of the rapidly rising challenger. And we know for a fact that leaders are actively engaging with this academic concept because they're talking about it openly. During a 2015 summit in Seattle, Chinese President Xi Jinping explicitly brought this up. He stated, "There is no such thing as the so-called Thucydides trap in the world. But should major countries time and again make the mistakes of strategic miscalculation, they might create such traps for themselves." It is a very clear acknowledgement from a world leader of the exact structural dangers outlined by the Belfer Center study.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the concept certainly hasn't faded. If anything, the anxiety around it has only grown. In a 2026 meeting with Donald Trump in Beijing, Xi Jinping repeated the sentiment. He asked, can China and the United States transcend the so-called Thucydides Trap and forge a new paradigm for major power relations? This proves that at the absolute highest levels of global leadership, regardless of the administration, the specter of this ancient Greek observation is sitting right there at the negotiating table.
So, hearing all of this, seeing the historical odds, and watching modern superpowers maneuver around each other, it's really easy to feel a sense of dread. It forces us to ask the ultimate question: does the trap always lead to war? Are we simply waiting for the inevitable, just like Thucydides described with Athens and Sparta? Well, let's take a collective breath here, because Graham Allison and many political leaders stress that this trap is a warning. It is not a prophecy. It means rising tensions make conflict more likely, but absolutely not unavoidable. Remember those numbers? History provided 4 distinct exceptions.
So, the crucial point is, how did those exceptions actually pull it off? How do you escape the trap? Let's break down the Belfer Center case studies, where war was successfully avoided. In the 15th century, Portugal and Spain managed their overlapping global ambitions through treaties instead of blood. In the early 20th century, Britain avoided war by making the highly calculated choice to step back as the U.S. rose to power. And during the Cold War, the intense rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union never turned into a direct hot war, thanks to mutually assured destruction and very careful back-channel diplomacy to keep the conflict cold.
These historical anomalies absolutely prove that peace is possible, but it requires incredibly difficult maneuvering. Graham Allison points out that when parties successfully avoided war in the past, it required, and this is his phrasing, huge, painful adjustments in attitudes and actions on the part of not just the challenger, but also the challenged. We're talking about surrendering spheres of influence, swallowing national pride, and fundamentally changing a country's global posture. So, I leave you with this provocative thought as you follow global diplomacy today. Looking at the world right now, are our rising and ruling powers prepared to make those huge, painful adjustments to avoid the trap? Understanding this history might just be the very first step in ensuring we don't repeat it. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.